Yeah, my daddy is the best storyteller. His name is Kofi.
She has been apologizing to a grave for 4 years. Every single night, every breath, every time her daughter laughed like him. 4 years of guilt so heavy it became her foundation. She believed it because they needed her to. Tonight, everything she built her survival on is crumbling in her hands because there is a photograph in this office that has no business existing, and the date on the back is making her question every single thing she accepted without asking. Her daughter is across the city right now, sitting beside the most feared man in Atlanta like he is an old friend. She has no idea who he is. He knows exactly what his family did. And when that little girl opens her mouth and says her daddy's name, just his name, the man who has made entire empires kneel is sitting on a terrace in the Atlanta night completely and totally destroyed, shaking, broken, by a 9-year-old girl who just wanted to keep a lonely man company. 3 worlds, one truth, and a love neither of them asked for standing directly in the path of everything about to explode. Everyone feared the Korean crime lord, until a black woman's daughter broke the man nobody could touch. Lovies, welcome to a story that will reach into your chest and rearrange something permanent. Tonight, Afro-Seoul TV is living between 2 worlds and going beyond all borders with a tearjerker that'll break you, a heartbreaker that'll leave you speechless, and a game changer you will never forget. Drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from? Atlanta, Houston, Chicago, Los Angeles? Let's see how far Zuri's impossible truth travels tonight. And lovies, if stories like this move your soul, super thanks and memberships keep these heartbreakers coming, but no pressure at all. Just having you in this family means everything. Now do not click away because what is about to unfold. That little girl, that photograph, that man nobody has ever broken. Atlanta, April. The Fox Theater dressed in its usual grandeur, holding 500 of the city's most influential names. Zuri stood backstage in her deep wine-red off-shoulder gown, gold embroidery at the waist, and took one breath. 4 months of work lived in every detail of this evening. She walked onto that stage the way she walked into every room, like she had already decided the outcome. 4 years ago, I stood in the city with nothing but a dead man's dream in my own 2 hands. Her voice filled the theater. Tonight, the OC Foundation serves 7 Atlanta schools, 230 families, and one very stubborn woman who refused to let that dream die. Warm laughter. Applause. Our anonymous donor this year made something possible that we have been working towards since day one. So to whoever you are, the main doors opened. Tall, unhurried, intricate tattoos climbing from wrist to neck, moving through that room like the space rearranged itself around him without his permission. She stopped mid-sentence for 2 full seconds. The whole room noticed. She pulled herself back and finished. And I thank you from the bottom of everything this foundation stands for. He was at the bottom of the podium steps when she came down. You stopped mid-sentence, low, unhurried. You were late, direct, no softening. I had already written a speech for someone I hadn't met. Was it good? Excellent. You missed it. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. I caught the second half. The second half was improvised. I know. His eyes stayed steady on her face. It was better. 3 full seconds she looked at him. Then someone pulled her away and she went. She did not look back. She absolutely looked back. He was still watching. That steadiness settled somewhere in her chest before she could stop it. His name was Kwon Tae-young, founder of Tae-young Arts Collective, the man behind 2 years of anonymous funding that had quietly transformed everything the foundation could reach. She had imagined this person many times. She had not imagined this. The following 2 weeks were professionally unavoidable. Site visits, strategy sessions, budget meetings that ran long because they disagreed about almost everything, and neither of them softened their position for the other's comfort. Your expansion model is too cautious. He said it without preamble in their second meeting. You're protecting what you have instead of building what you need. I'm protecting what Kofi built. She held his gaze without blinking. Until you've kept someone's dream alive for 4 years with your own hands, you don't get to call that caution. A pause. Fair. She hadn't expected that. The immediate concession without ego. It moved something small and inconvenient behind her carefully maintained composure. Every meeting ran hotter than the last. Every disagreement stripped another layer. She found herself in her car afterward reconsidering positions she had held for years, and that made her deeply uncomfortable in ways she refused to examine too closely. The pull between them was not soft or romantic. It was a specific electricity of two people who had each spent years being the sharpest person in every room, suddenly finding someone who refused to yield an inch. She felt it, distrusted it completely, had zero emotional bandwidth for whatever it was trying to become, had a daughter who needed all of her, had 4 years of carefully rebuilt life. She was not about to compromise. Filed it under irrelevant, kept moving. Imani met him on a Tuesday afternoon site visit. She assessed Kwon Tae-young in 30 seconds with the full thoroughness of a 9-year-old who took her mother's piece seriously. Why do you have so many tattoos? Each one marks something I survived. Imani considered that with genuine seriousness. Do you speak Korean? I do. Her eyes lit up completely. She switched to Korean without warning and fired a question at him that made him blink once and then laugh. A real laugh. Sudden, completely unguarded, the kind that came from somewhere genuine. Zuri watched it happen and felt something shift in her chest before she could redirect it. On the drive home, Imani delivered her verdict in the specific tone of someone announcing a decision that was not up for debate. Zuri listened and then laughed. Her own real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and felt it leave her body before she could pull it back. That laugh was a door she had been keeping shut for 4 years. She had just let it open without permission, and she felt the specific vulnerability of that the entire drive home. Across Atlanta in a Buckhead estate behind walls most of the city would never see past, Kwon Jae-sung received the gala surveillance photographs. Standard procedure. He monitored Tae-young's public appearances the way he monitored everything. The photograph of his son beside a woman should have been unremarkable. Something made him request a full intelligence report before he finished his morning tea. Not logic, instinct. The same instinct that had kept him alive for 40 years. The report arrived by afternoon. He read every page without rushing. Page 47 stopped him. A family tree, standard documentation, and a photograph of a young man Jae-sung had not seen in 38 years. Seo-jun, his younger brother, who left Korea for Ghana at 22, who had a son before illness took him, a son who came to America and built something beautiful and married a woman named Zuri and had a daughter named Imani and died 4 years ago in Atlanta in what was documented as a car accident. Jae-sung sat in his office alone for 4 hours. Not one sound, not one movement. His security detail outside the door heard nothing because the most dangerous version of Kwon Jae-sung had always been the silent one. But inside that office, the most controlled mind in Atlanta's underworld was sitting inside one understanding that no amount of empire could have prepared him for. His own nephew, his brother's only son. He had listened to him, thanked him, offered him water, and made one phone call 20 minutes after he walked out the door. His hands took 11 minutes to stop trembling. In 40 years, they had never trembled before. He canceled all planned action against Zuri without explanation. Called a lawyer he had not spoken to in 11 years. Said nothing to anyone. 3 weeks later, a Korean-American cultural fundraiser brought both their worlds into the same building. Zuri wore a deep cobalt silk wrap dress with gold accessories and kept Imani close beside her as she worked the room. Sarah Yoon moved through the reception with the grace of someone performing composure rather than feeling it. Zuri clocked her immediately, filed her as a threat connected to Jae-sung's world, said nothing, watched everything. During the interval, Imani slipped away. She found what she always found in crowded adult spaces. A quieter corridor, a private door, a terrace opening onto the Atlanta night with the city spread below, like something her daddy used to describe. She stepped out and found she was not alone. An old man stood at the railing looking at the city below with the face of someone mid-conversation with someone who wasn't there. Imani sat beside him without being invited because he looked like someone who needed company, and she had never once in her 9 years walked past someone who needed company. Atlanta looks like spilled stars at night. She said it easily, like continuing a conversation already started. My daddy used to say that. Jae-sung said nothing. He died when I was 5. She looked at the city. But I still talk to him. Mama says people don't really disappear. They just change address. His hands tightened on the railing. His name was Kofi. She said it the way children say the most devastating things. Simply, easily, like it cost her nothing. It cost him everything. The most feared man in Atlanta could not speak, could not move, was looking at his brother's eyes in this child's face while her daddy's name hung in the Atlanta air between them like something sacred and completely irreversible. Something behind his eyes was coming apart in a way that no enemy, no rival, no courtroom had ever touched in 40 years. Zuri pushed through the terrace door 4 minutes later and stopped. Her daughter, beside Kwon Jae-sung, in the Atlanta night, like old friends. In Jae-sung's face, always composed, always controlled, always carrying the stillness of a man who had never needed to perform calm because calm was simply his nature. That face was carrying something she had never seen on any human being in her life, something raw and ancient and completely unguarded. She didn't have a name for it. She just knew it was real and enormous and connected to her daughter, and that understanding moved through her like ice water. Imani hopped off the bench cheerfully. Mama, this is my friend. We both like the quiet spots. Jae-sung stood, looked at Zuri, looked at Imani, then back at Zuri with something in his eyes that lasted 1 moment before the mask returned completely. He walked past them into the building without a single word. The door closed. Zuri stood on that terrace holding her daughter's hand with Atlanta glittering below and felt the specific cold of someone who has just witnessed something enormous without understanding a single thing about what it means. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, she arrived at the foundation before anyone else. Coffee made, schedule reviewed. She moved through the shared office space the way she moved through it every morning. She almost missed it. A photograph, face down, on the desk nearest the window. It had not been there yesterday. She knew every surface of this foundation the way she knew her own apartment. She stood over it for a moment before she touched it. Then she turned it over. Kofi's face looked back at her. Young, smiling, alive, standing beside a man whose eyes she now knew better than she should. Taeyang's eyes, unmistakably. She turned it over. A date in handwriting she had never seen. 3 days before the accident. The coffee in her hand was warm. The building was quiet. Atlanta was waking up outside the windows. And Zuri stood completely still in that empty office, feeling 4 years of carefully constructed survival cracking open from the inside because someone placed this photograph here deliberately, and the date on the back was asking a question about the accident that she had never once in 4 years thought to ask. 3 days before he never came home. Someone knew. Someone had always known something. And the man whose eyes were in this photograph with her dead husband had been sitting across from her in this very building for 2 weeks. She did not sleep. Not 1 hour. She lay in the dark with that photograph behind her eyes and the date on the back running through everything she had accepted without question for 4 years. 3 days before the accident. She was not a woman who panicked. She was a woman who found the truth and then decided what to do with it. By the time Imani came padding into the kitchen, Zuri had already made 3 decisions. No confronting Taeyang yet. No showing fear to anyone. Pull every available thread quietly before moving in any direction. Mama, you made my eggs wrong. I make your eggs the same way every single morning, Imani. Imani examined her plate with deep suspicion. Something is different today. Nothing is different. Eat your eggs. Imani ate. Zuri drank her coffee and stared at nothing and smiled whenever her daughter looked up. She dropped Imani at school, drove back, sat at her kitchen table, and opened Kofi's personal calendar she had never deleted from their shared cloud account. Cross-referenced it against the foundation's earliest financial records. cross-referenced both against Taiyang Arts Collective's founding date, an anonymous donor meeting in Kofi's calendar 8 years ago, a location that no longer existed, a building that traced through 3 shell companies directly back to Kwon Global Investments. She sat with that at 2 a.m. and felt the specific cold of a woman understanding that the ground beneath her life had never been as solid as she believed. She called a former colleague at Atlanta's most respected investigative financial firm the next morning. "I need a quiet background trace. Kwon Global Investments. Off the record, completely personal." Silence. "Zuri, that is not a small name." "I know exactly what it is. Can you do it?" A pause. "Give me 72 hours. She hung up. This was her active choice, her decision. 4 years of looking inward, and she was done. She walked into the foundation programming review that morning and sat across from Taeyong and gave him absolutely nothing. Warm, professional, every response correct. He noticed anyway. "You're different today. Quiet. Not an accusation." "I'm exactly the same." Direct eye contact, not a flicker. He held her gaze for a moment, then moved back to the agenda. But she caught the way his attention sharpened underneath the professional surface and filed it alongside everything else she was quietly assembling. Across the city, Taeyang was sitting at his desk, staring at a researcher's report that had been waiting for 72 hours. He opened it. Kofi Ose. He read the name, put the report down, stood at his office window looking at Atlanta below, and stayed there for a very long time. 8 years ago, he had recruited 3 anonymous sources to document his father's operations from the inside. 3 people he had never met face to face, never knew by real name. One by one, the silence came. The last one 4 years ago, without explanation. He had filed it as the cost of the war he was fighting and kept moving. That source was Kofi Ose, the man who built the foundation, who married Zuri, who had a daughter named Imani who switched to Korean without warning and made him laugh in a way he hadn't laughed in years. That man had sat across from Jae-sung 4 years ago and offered him grace and been destroyed for it, while Taeyang noted the silence and kept moving. He stood at that window and let the full weight of that land on him without moving away from it. The specific guilt of inaction, of a silence chosen not to question, of a woman who had been apologizing to a grave for 4 years for something that was never her fault, while the man who set the chain of events in motion was 3 miles away, reading her words and calling it admiration. He sat back down, put his head in his hands. He had been building a case against his father for 14 months, had been gathering evidence, protecting sources, preparing for the moment he could hand everything over and finally close that chapter. He had told himself it was for justice, for the people his father had destroyed. Kofi Ose's name sitting on that report told him something he had not wanted to know about his own motivations, that the careful distance he had maintained from Zuri, the anonymous funding, the annual reports read like letters. None of it was simply admiration. He had been circling the wreckage of what his father did to her family for 2 years without the courage to walk into it directly. He picked up his phone, put it down. Not yet. He needed to understand the full shape before he put Zuri in the center of it. That decision was going to cost him. He knew it. He made it anyway. Sarah appeared at Imani's Korean language immersion school showcase on Thursday afternoon with no obvious reason to be there. 3 rows behind Zuri, still, watchful. Imani spotted her from the stage mid-performance and her entire face transformed. She waved with both hands with the complete uninhibited joy of a child who had already decided this person belonged in her world. Several parents around Zuri turned to see who the wave was for. Zuri turned, saw Sarah. Every protective instinct she had fired at once. After the showcase, Imani sprinted to Sarah before Zuri could intercept. "You came." Imani grabbed her hand with complete ownership. "I said I would, didn't I?" Sarah's warmth with Imani was the one thing about her that was entirely unperformed. Zuri appeared beside her daughter, perfectly pleasant, eyes reading everything. "I didn't know you'd be here." Imani mentioned it. "I hope that's all right." "Of course." A smile that gave nothing away. They stood in the school corridor together for several minutes, Amani doing most of the talking, describing her performance in detail, explaining the specific Korean phrases she had used and why they were difficult, and how she had practiced them 17 times the night before. 17 times? Sarah looked genuinely impressed. Mama counted. Amani said it with complete satisfaction. Zuri caught Sarah's genuine smile at that and filed it away alongside everything else. Then a parent nearby mentioned Jae-sung's name in passing. Sarah's hands stilled for exactly 2 seconds. 2 seconds. Perfectly controlled. But Zuri caught it completely. On the drive home, Imani was still talking. She really came, Mama. I told her about it at the fundraiser and she actually came. I see that. She laughs with her eyes. Imani said it with the authority of someone stating established fact. Most adults don't do that. Zuri drove and said nothing and thought about 2 seconds of stillness at the sound of one name and what that specific stillness meant in the body of a woman performing composure. The foundation board dinner 2 days later. 20 of Atlanta's most respected cultural leaders around a long table. Zuri at one end, Taeyang at the other. Everything professional. Everything correct. But underneath every exchange, a current that neither of them could fully suppress. They had been in the same professional orbit for weeks now. Every meeting had run hotter than the last. Every disagreement had stripped another layer. And now with everything Zuri knew sitting quietly behind her composed exterior, the current between them carried something new. Something charged with the specific tension of two people who are falling toward each other while standing on opposite sides of a truth that could detonate everything. Midway through dinner, the conversation turned to cultural legacy. Zuri spoke without looking at him. Kofi always said culture was the only inheritance that couldn't be taken away. You could take a man's money, his land, his status, but give him his story back and you give him everything. The table was moved. Several board members nodded. Taeyang was very still for half a second too long. Zuri felt it from across the table without looking directly at him. That specific stillness, the same one she had caught in their programming review. She let it sit, said nothing, smiled at the board member beside her, and continued the conversation. But her pulse was not steady. After dinner, she sat in her car and called her colleague back. Did you find anything? Zuri, a pause heavy with everything it contained. Where did you get this name from? What did you find? A pattern. Financial transfers through shell accounts. It goes back further than I expected, and it reaches further than I want to tell you over the phone. Another pause. Be careful. This is not a small thread you are pulling on. She hung up, sat in the darkness outside the restaurant, the shell companies, the date on the photograph, Taeyang's stillness, all of it assembling into a shape she could no longer pretend she wasn't seeing. She sat with it for a long time. Then she drove home. Imani was still awake when she walked in, sitting at the kitchen table with her homework spread everywhere and a bowl of cereal she had made herself because she had decided 9 o'clock was a reasonable time for cereal. You're up late. Zuri dropped her bag and sat beside her. I was waiting for you. Imani said it simply, like it was obvious. You had your thinking face all morning. I wanted to make sure you were okay. Zuri looked at her daughter, this child who noticed everything, who laughed with her eyes and waited up and made herself cereal and carried her daddy's gift for making people feel completely seen. I'm okay, baby. Imani studied her for a moment with the specific assessment of a 9-year-old who had been her mother's person for 4 years and knew every variation of okay that existed. Okay. She went back to her homework. There's cereal if you want some. Zuri sat beside her daughter at the kitchen table and felt something steady and permanent move through her chest. Whatever was coming, she was going to face it. For this child who waited up. For Kofi, whose dreams she was still carrying. For herself. She was ready. 3 days later, Jae-sung made his move. Not with lawyers, not with leverage, not with any of the considerable resources still available to him. A handwritten note delivered to the foundation by a courier with no return information. One sentence, a time, a location. Zuri read it twice, then a third time. Not a threat, Not a summons, an acknowledgement. 3 words that told her he knew that she knew and that he was not running from it. She was still holding the note when her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. 4 words. Don't go alone tonight. She looked up. Through the foundation's glass frontage, she could see a car parked across the street. Sarah, watching the building, had been there long enough to know the note had arrived. Zuri walked outside. Sarah rolled down her window. How long have you been watching this building? Not angry, just direct. Long enough. Sarah reached into her bag and placed a small drive on the window ledge between them. Before you respond to that note, you need to hear what is on this first. Zuri looked at the drive, looked at Sarah. 2 years of Jae-sung's world living in this woman's eyes. 2 years of evidence built in silence. 2 years of waiting for exactly this moment. If I take that drive, Zuri held her gaze. There is no version of what comes next that is safe for either of us. I know. Sarah did not look away. I stopped choosing safe 2 years ago. I've just been surviving since then. I'm tired of surviving. A long moment between them. Zuri picked up the drive. Get out of the car. Come inside. What Sarah told her over the next hour came piece by devastating piece. Transaction records, shell accounts, a pattern of calculated eliminations stretching back further than Zuri had imagined. Names and dates rearranging the architecture of everything she thought she understood about the last 4 years. And then the piece that undid everything. The car was tampered with before Kofi ever called you that evening? Sarah's voice was steady, careful, like someone delivering something breakable. Before you told him to drive, the decision had already been made. They needed you to have something to blame yourself for so you would never look anywhere else. The foundation was quiet around them. 4 years, Zuri said it softly, not to Sarah, to herself. 4 years. Sarah confirmed it gently. The guilt she had carried every single morning for 4 years, built her entire survival on, breathed in and out without question. It had been placed there deliberately by the same hands that placed everything else. It was never hers. It had never been hers. Zuri sat completely still and let that move through her and dismantle everything it touched. She did not cry. She did not collapse. She sat with it the way she sat with every hard thing completely present inside it until she understood its full shape. In her bedroom across the city, Amani was asleep. 9 years old and completely whole and unaware that her mother was sitting in an empty foundation office being rebuilt from the inside out by a truth that should have been hers 4 years ago. A knock at the foundation door. Both women looked up. Taeyong stood outside in the Atlanta night. He had come because he had made a decision on the drive over and was not turning back. He had the full weight of what he knew on his face and he was done carrying it alone. He saw Sarah through the glass. He saw Zuri's face. And in one breath, Kwon Taeyong understood that the 72 hours he had spent deciding whether to tell her the truth had just expired completely without his permission. Zuri looked at him through the glass, said nothing. Her eyes asked the only question that existed between them now. How much did you know and when? The Atlanta night pressed quietly against the foundation windows. And Taeyong, standing outside, understood that the next words out of his mouth were going to cost him everything or save everything, and there was no version of what came next that was easy or painless or safe. But he had stopped choosing safe the moment he opened that researcher's report. He reached for the door. Taeyong walked through that door and Zuri did not move from where she was sitting. She just watched him come in, quietly, completely, the way she had been watching everything for weeks. He looked at Sarah first, then back at Zuri, and whatever carefully constructed approach he had built on the drive over dissolved completely because her face told him she already knew enough, and the only thing left was whether he was going to be honest or whether he was going to manage this the way he had managed everything else for 8 years. He pulled out a chair and sat down. How much do you already know? Not defensive, just direct. Enough. Zuri held his gaze. But I want to hear it from you. He told her everything. Not the managed version, not the version that protected him from the worst of it. The anonymous source recruitment 8 years ago. The encrypted channels. The 3 people whose silence he had accepted one by one as the cost of the war he was fighting. The researcher's report sitting on his desk for 72 hours while he gathered the courage to open it. Kofi's name on that report. The 72 hours after that, when he sat with what it meant and still did not come to her. He laid every truth on the table and left it there without explanation or defense. The foundation was quiet around them. Atlanta moved outside the windows. Zuri sat with everything he said and let it find its place alongside everything Sarah had already told her. The full picture assembling itself completely for the first time. Sarah watched them both and said nothing. Then Zuri asked him one question. Not about Kofi, not about his father, not about the 72 hours. Why did you keep funding the foundation for 2 years after your source went dark? She held his gaze steady. You could have redirected those resources anywhere in Atlanta. Why did you keep choosing us? The question sat in the room. Taeyang looked at her across that table, at this woman who had been holding everything together through sheer will while carrying guilt that was never hers, who had built something extraordinary from grief, who had raised a daughter who waited up with cereal and laughed with her eyes and sat beside the most feared man in Atlanta because he looked like he needed company. Because I read your first annual report 2 years ago. His voice was quiet, honest. The way you wrote about what Kofi believed about culture being the only inheritance that couldn't be taken away. I had not read anything that honest in years. I needed to be near something honest, even from a distance. Zuri did not look away. And then I saw you at the podium. He continued. You stopped mid-sentence for 2 seconds, and I understood something I had no framework for. What did you understand? That the distance I had been keeping was not going to hold. The room was completely still. Sarah quietly moved to the window, giving them the only privacy the space allowed. Zuri sat with what he said moving through her and thought about what Kofi believed about grace. That it was the only currency that compounded without limit. That the most radical thing a person could do with grief was refuse to let it be the last word. She was not ready to say that out loud yet, but she felt it moving in her chest and she did not stop it. Okay, she said it quietly. Not forgiveness, not absolution. Simply the specific word of a woman who has received the full truth and is choosing what to do with it on her own terms. Now we figure out what comes next. Taeyang exhaled for what felt like the first time in 72 hours. Sarah turned from the window. I can tell you exactly what comes next. The 3 of them spent the next 3 days in Taeyang's arts collective space, away from Jae-sung's surveillance network, which Taeyang dismantled access point by access point with the methodical precision of someone who had spent 8 years learning exactly how his father watched the world. Zuri brought her research. Sarah brought her evidence package. Taeyang brought 14 months of carefully documented financial intelligence. What they built together across those 3 days was not just a case. It was a complete, unimpeachable dismantling of 40 years of architecture. Sarah's recordings layered against Taeyang's financial documentation, layered against Zuri's forensic research, produced something that left no exits and no alternative interpretations. Amani came every afternoon because school was out and Zuri was not leaving her daughter anywhere she could not see her. She sat at the corner of the long table with her homework and her colored pencils and her cereal, which she had decided was a perfectly acceptable afternoon snack in any location. On the second afternoon, she looked up from her drawing and studied Taeyang's tattoos with the focused attention she gave everything that genuinely interested her. What does that one mean? She pointed to the piece climbing his left forearm. That one is for the first thing I built that was entirely my own. The Arts Collective? Yes. Amani considered that seriously. So you put it on your body so you'd never forget. Something like that. She went back to her drawing, then without looking up. I have a scar on my knee from when I fell learning to ride my bike. Mama cried more than I did. A pause. She says scars just mean you were brave enough to try. Taeyang looked at Zuri across the table. Zuri was looking at her daughter with the specific expression of a woman who understood that her child was occasionally wiser than everyone in the room combined. On the third day they were ready. Zuri made the final call on delivery. Not law enforcement, not media, her decision, active and entirely her own. We deliver it to the community. She said it with complete certainty. Every elder, every board member, every institution his philanthropy has touched, every family whose silence he has purchased. That is his entire world. Taeyang said it carefully. Not as an objection, as a confirmation of the weight of what she was choosing. I know exactly what it is. She held his gaze. He counted on my grief to keep me looking the wrong way for 4 years. I am done looking the wrong way. Sarah looked at her with the specific expression of a woman recognizing herself in someone else. Are you sure? Kofi sat across from that man and offered him grace. Her voice was completely steady. He destroyed that grace with a phone call. The least I can do is make sure the world he built that grace to impress knows exactly what he did with it. The evidence package went out that evening, simultaneously, to every elder in Atlanta's Korean American community, every board member of every institution Ye-sung's philanthropy had built, every family whose silence he had purchased across 4 decades. Structured, documented, unimpeachable, delivered to the only audience whose opinion Jae-sung had ever genuinely valued. By morning, his philanthropist mask was dissolving quietly and completely in the exact rooms he had built it to impress. Phone calls between elders, emergency board meetings, institutions that carried his name on their walls sitting with the specific devastation of people who had built their own legacies on integrity and discovered the foundation beneath them was compromised. In his Buckhead estate, Jae-sung sat alone in his study and watched it happen through the calls that stopped coming and the silence that replaced them. His lawyer called first. I need to know how you want to respond. I don't, he said it quietly and hung up. His longest-standing business associate called 20 minutes later. Jae-sung, we need to discuss damage control. There is no damage to control. Completely calm. Let it stand. Silence on the line. Then the call disconnected. He sat in that study for 4 hours, not calculating, not strategizing, not running the numbers on what could be salvaged, just sitting with the full weight of what 40 years of calculated decisions had produced. The philanthropist's mask dissolving in the rooms that mattered most, and him choosing not to rebuild it. He thought about Seo-jun, his brother who left because Jae-sung's choices made staying impossible, who built a life and had a son and died young, while Jae-sung built an empire that eventually destroyed the last piece of Seo-jun that existed in the world. He thought about a 9-year-old girl on a terrace saying her daddy's name like it cost her nothing. It cost him everything. He picked up his phone and made one call, not to a lawyer, not to a business associate, to a number he had looked up 3 days ago and not yet used, a restorative justice counselor whose name had appeared in his research the night after Imani sat beside him on that terrace and said her daddy's name into the Atlanta night. The call lasted 4 minutes. When he hung up, his hands were not trembling. They were still. But it was a different kind of stillness than the one that had governed him for 40 years. Not the stillness of a man in control. The stillness of a man who had finally stopped running from the thing he could not outrun. Taeyang found out his father had not fought it from his own security network. He sat with that for a long time. 14 months of building a case, preparing for the moment he could bring his father down. And his father had brought himself down instead. Not from weakness, from something Taeyang had no name for yet and would spend a long time learning how to hold. Sarah's brother Hyun called her on the second morning. His debt to Jae-sung's network was gone, dissolved with everything else. He kept asking if she was sure. She kept saying yes. By the end of the call, they were both laughing and crying simultaneously in the way of people who have been separated from something precious for too long and have suddenly found it returned. She sat in Zuri's kitchen afterward and cried properly for the first time in 2 years. Real tears from somewhere deep that had been held under enormous pressure for so long that the release of it was almost physical. Imani appeared beside her without being asked, sat close, handed her a paper towel with the solemn efficiency of a child who took the business of comfort seriously. Mama says crying means something finally got to move. She said it like she was sharing important information. It's been stuck inside you for a long time, hasn't it? Sarah looked at this child and laughed through her tears. Yes, it has. Good. Amani nodded with complete satisfaction. Now it can go somewhere else. Zuri stood in the kitchen doorway watching her daughter comfort a woman she had met 3 weeks ago, like she had known her entire life, and felt something warm and permanent settle in her chest. This is what Kofi meant about grace compounding without limit. 3 days after the evidence package, Taeyang came to Zuri alone. Not to discuss strategy, not to manage what came next, just himself, standing in her foundation office in the late Atlanta afternoon with the specific vulnerability of a man who has spent 8 years building walls and has finally decided the walls cost more than they protect. I want to ask you something, he said it quietly. Ask. I know what I'm asking contains. I know what it means to ask a woman who lost her husband to consider trusting the future again. I know this is not simple, and I am not asking you to pretend it is. He held her gaze. I am asking if you will let me show up every day, honestly, for as long as you will allow it. Zuri looked at this man who had laid every truth on the table at enormous personal cost, who had answered every one of Imani's questions honestly, who had sent the evidence knowing it would bring down his own father, who had stopped choosing safe and started choosing truth. She thought about what Kofi believed about grace. She thought about Imani waiting up with cereal. She thought about 4 years of building and carrying and refusing to be erased. She was ready to be witnessed. She opened her mouth to answer. Her phone rang. The school administrator from Imani's Korean language immersion school, calling to inform her of an anonymous donation made that morning. A full arts scholarship endowed in Kofi Ose's name. No announcement, no press release, no name attached. Zuri knew immediately. She stood in her foundation office with her phone in her hand in the Atlanta afternoon coming through the windows and sat with the specific complexity of what it meant that the man who had destroyed her family was beginning the long, slow work of acknowledging the cost. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not for a long time, but something. She lowered the phone, looked at Taeyang, and the question in her eyes was no longer the one she had asked him from across that table 3 weeks ago. This one was quieter, more personal, more terrifying, and more necessary than anything that had come before it. And Atlanta held its breath waiting for her answer. She said yes. Not dramatically, not with tears, not with a speech that tried to contain everything the moment held. Just a quiet, steady yes from a woman who had done the internal work and arrived at her own answer in her own time on her own terms. Taeyang looked at her for a long moment, like he was checking the specific quality of light in the room to confirm this was real. Then something in his face shifted. Not relief exactly, something quieter and more permanent. The specific expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy alone for a very long time and has finally been told he doesn't have to carry it anymore. Neither of them moved for a moment. The foundation was quiet around them. Atlanta moved outside the windows, and in that stillness between two people who had found each other through fire and loss and truth told at enormous personal cost, something settled into place that neither of them had words for yet. They didn't need words yet. Imani walked in from the kitchen with her cereal bowl and looked between them with the specific assessment of a 9-year-old who notices everything and pretends to notice nothing. Did something happen? Something happened. Zuri looked at her daughter with the warmest smile she had produced in 4 years. Imani looked at Taeyang, then back at her mother, then at Taeyang again with the focused attention of someone making a final determination that would not be revisited. Okay. She sat down at the table with her cereal. Good. That was all. But the small, satisfied smile she directed at her bowl for the next 30 seconds said everything the occasion required. The weeks that followed were not simple. The fallout from the evidence package continued rippling through Atlanta's Korean-American community in ways that required careful navigation. Taeyang's name was connected to his father's world in ways that demanded untangling. His federal contact resurfaced within days of the package going public, and the conversation that followed was long and complicated, and ultimately cleared a path forward that cost him certain things and preserved what mattered most. His arts collective remained untouched. His legitimate empire stood. His freedom was intact. The untangling took 3 weeks of careful, precise work, and during those 3 weeks, he and Zuri existed in the specific, suspended reality of two people who have chosen each other and are now learning what that choice actually requires when the world keeps moving around it. Some evenings were easy, some were not. Both kinds were honest. Sarah moved through the fallout with the grace of a woman who had been preparing for this moment for 2 years. Her brother Hyun visited Atlanta for the first time in 4 years, the week after the package went out. He sat in Zuri's living room and cried without embarrassment and thanked people he had never met for giving him his sister back. Imani sat beside him the entire visit and handed him paper towels with the same solemn efficiency she had offered Sarah. "You cry like Miss Sarah," she observed it clinically. Hyun laughed so hard he knocked his paper towel off his knee. "She told me about you." He looked at Imani with genuine warmth. "She said you were the bravest person she met in Atlanta." Imani absorbed that with the dignity of someone receiving information that confirmed what they already suspected. "I know." She went back to her drawing. Zuri caught Sarah's eye across the room. They both pressed their lips together to keep from laughing and failed completely. Something genuine and lasting had taken root between them. Not the alliance of circumstance that had brought them together. Something that had grown in the specific soil of shared fire and mutual respect. And one 9-year-old girl who had decided Sarah belonged in her world before any adult had figured out whether that was safe. Yaesung attended his first restorative justice session on a Tuesday morning. He drove himself. No security, no entourage. Just an old man in a quiet suit parking in an ordinary lot and walking into an ordinary building to sit across from a counselor who would not be impressed by his name or his history. The session lasted 1 hour. He drove home afterward and sat in his car outside his Buckhead estate for 20 minutes before going inside. The specific discomfort of being seen clearly by someone whose job was clarity, of being asked questions that had no strategic answers, of discovering that the vocabulary he had built over 40 years had absolutely no words for what he was being asked to do. He went back the following Tuesday and the one after that. He began writing letters he would never send. To Seojun, to Kofi, to the younger version of himself who made the first terrible calculation and called it protection. His counselors said the letters were not for sending. They were for seeing, for making the invisible cost of every choice visible on paper where it could not be managed or minimized. He filled 2 notebooks in the first month, started a third. Some sessions he arrived composed and left unable to maintain it. He did not find this process therapeutic in the way people describe therapy. He found it excruciating. He went back anyway because a 9-year-old girl told him her daddy gave her the name Faith, and the least he could do with whatever time remained was become someone who deserved to sit in the same world as that child without the full weight of what he took from her, crushing him completely. One morning he drove to the Osei Foundation, parked across the street, sat looking at the building Kofi had built, and Zuri had kept standing. Did not go inside, just sat with it for a while, then started the car and drove away. He would not be given a seat at that table. He understood that. He was not looking for a seat. He was looking for the slow, painful, honest work of becoming someone who deserved to exist in the same world as the people his choices had cost so much. That work had no finish line. He was beginning to understand that was the point. The Osei Foundation and Taeyang Arts Collective announced their joint initiative on a bright Atlanta morning 6 weeks after everything detonated, a collaborative heritage arts program bringing Korean and African cultural programming to 12 Atlanta schools simultaneously. The announcement carried both their names. Atlanta noticed. The city that had watched these two parallel worlds operate in deliberate separation for decades sat up and paid attention. This was what between two worlds actually looked like. Not the erasure of difference, the celebration of it, built by two people who had found each other in the wreckage of someone else's choices and decided to build something that honored every world they carried. Sarah launched her consulting firm the same week, Ethical Corporate Governance. 6 years of witnessing the darkest version of what unethical governance looked like from the inside had given her something she was going to spend the rest of her career putting to use. I have 3 clients already. She said it over coffee with Zuri on a Tuesday morning with the specific excitement of someone doing something entirely their own for the first time. Of course you do. Zuri said it like it was obvious. You know more about how these systems fail than anyone in this city. That knowledge is worth something. Sarah looked at her across the coffee table. I spent 2 years thinking that knowledge was a burden. It was. Zuri held her gaze. Now it is something else. Amani won the Korean Language Immersion School's annual poetry competition 4 months later. Her poem was about a girl who lived between 2 worlds and belonged completely to both. The teacher who read it to the assembled school did not know the full weight of what she was reading. Only Zuri, sitting in the 3rd row, and Taeyang beside her, and Sarah 2 seats down, understood every layer of what that poem contained. Zuri held herself together through the reading and cried quietly in the car afterward, while Imani patted her hand with patient understanding. It's a good cry, Mama. Imani said it with complete certainty. I can tell the difference. I know, baby. Zuri laughed through it. I know. The wedding was not large, not elaborate, exactly what both of them were. Precise, intentional, deeply felt. Atlanta's spring light coming through the windows of the Osei Foundation's main gallery, which Zuri chose specifically because Kofi built it, and she wanted him present in the room where she began again. She wore an ivory, structured gown with intricate gold embroidery running from the waist to the hem, her Senegalese twist pinned up with gold thread, her grandmother's earrings at her ears. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had been through the fire and come out the other side, not unscathed but unbroken, whole, chosen, herself. Amani was the flower girl and took the responsibility with the seriousness of someone who understood the full weight of the moment. She walked down the aisle with the particular dignity of a 9-year-old who had decided she was also essentially getting married today by proximity, and when she reached the front, she turned and gave the assembled guests a satisfied nod that produced laughter from every single person in the room. Sarah stood beside Zuri, not as a performance of alliance, as family. Her brother Hyun sat in the 3rd row and cried without embarrassment from the moment the music started. The ceremony was simple and honest and completely alive. Every word meant, every moment felt. Then Zuri saw him. Back row, quiet dark suit. No security, no entourage. Sitting alone with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes forward. The specific stillness of a man who has not been given a seat at the table and has come anyway, because the least he can do is witness what his choices cost and what love built in spite of them. Jae-sung had received 1 card in the mail, the wedding date, the address, nothing else. He understood what that card was, not an invitation to belong, an acknowledgement that the door was not permanently closed. He had driven himself, arrived early, sat in the back. Nobody asked him to move. But halfway through the reception, Imani appeared beside him. She had spotted him the moment she arrived at the front during the ceremony, had been watching him quietly throughout. She sat beside him on that back row chair with the same ease she had sat beside him on the terrace, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like they were old friends who liked the quiet spots. She did not say anything for a while, just sat with him, giving him company because he looked like someone who needed it. Then she looked up at her mother dancing with Taeyang in the golden afternoon light, and said something to him quietly. He listened, nodded once. What she said stayed between them. The audience did not hear it. They could only see what it did to his face. The specific expression of a man receiving something he did not believe he deserved and choosing to receive it anyway because refusing it would cost him the last thing he had left to lose. He sat in that back row for the rest of the reception, not given a place at the table. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time, but present, witnessing, beginning the long, slow work of earning 1 daily choice at a time. Lovies, before we see where this family lands 7 months later, take 1 breath with us. If you have made it this far, then you already know. This story got into your chest and rearranged something, didn't it? Between two worlds and beyond all borders, we promised you a tearjerker, a heartbreaker, and a game changer in loveys. Did Zuri and Taeyong's story deliver? Are you crying? Smiling? Both at the same time? Drop it in the comments right now. Are you watching from Miami, Dallas, Charlotte, somewhere across this beautiful world? Let us see how far this family story traveled tonight. And lovies, if this kind of storytelling moves your soul. Super thanks and memberships are how you give us a standing ovation. No pressure, ever. Just know that every single one keeps these heartbreakers coming. Now tell us, would you have made the same choices Zuri made? Could you have opened that door to Sarah? Could you have said yes after everything? Tell us everything. Now let's see where this family lands. 7 months later, Atlanta summer had settled in warm and unhurried. The joint initiative was in its second month across 12 Atlanta schools. Feedback coming back from teachers and parents and students was the kind that made Zuri read it twice just to feel it fully. Children who had never considered their cultural heritage something to celebrate were coming home asking questions and making things and telling stories. Kofi had believed culture was the only inheritance that couldn't be taken away. She watched his belief compounding without limit every single day. Taeyong sat across from her at the foundation conference table on a Tuesday afternoon, reviewing program reports while Amani did homework at the corner with her cereal and her colored pencils in the specific, contented energy of a child who understood that this table had become her family's table, and she belonged at it completely. He looked up from the report and caught Zuri watching him. What? Nothing. She looked back at her document. You have your thinking face. I always have my thinking face. This is a different thinking face. She looked up, held his gaze. I was thinking that Kofi would have liked you. Taeyong was quiet for a moment. Tell me something he would have said. She thought about it. He would have said that the bravest thing a person can do is choose love in a world that keeps giving them reasons not to. Taeyong looked at her across that table in the Atlanta afternoon light and felt the full weight of everything it had taken to be sitting in this room in this moment, and he found that the weight was not heavy anymore. It was simply true. Amani looked up from her homework. Are you two being romantic again? We are adults. Zuri said it with dignity. That's not a no. Imani went back to her homework. Taeyong laughed. Zuri laughed. The foundation filled with it completely. Outside, Atlanta moved and hummed and went about its beautiful, complicated business. And across the city, in a restorative justice session on a Tuesday morning, Kwon Jae-sung was filling the last pages of his third notebook, choosing for the 112th consecutive day to show up differently than he had before. Not redemption, not forgiveness. Simply a man doing the only honest thing left available to him. Showing up, every day, one choice at a time, between two worlds, beyond all borders. This is what love looks like when it refuses to be the last casualty of someone else's war. This is what grace looks like when it finally stops running and turns around and says, I am still here. I was always still here. And in the foundation on a Tuesday afternoon, a little girl with her daddy's eyes and her mother's spine looked up from her homework and said, Mama, can we get dinner from the Korean Ghanaian place on Peachtree? And Zuri said yes. And Taeyong said he would drive. And Imani packed up her cereal and her colored pencils with the satisfied efficiency of someone whose world was exactly the right size, and Atlanta held all three of them in its warm, complicated arms and called it home.